Hello and welcome to the first episode of Middleware Friday for January 6th, 2017. In this episode, this is what we're going to talk about. First, I'll introduce myself for those of you who may not know who I am. Next, we're going to talk about why this vlog. Why am I doing this? Why am I getting involved in this project? Third thing we'll be looking at is some feature content, which includes protecting Azure Logic Apps using the new API management experience in Azure. And lastly, we're going to focus on Community Corner, where we'll highlight some recent content delivered by the community for the community. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kent Weir. I'm an Azure MVP. I've co-authored a few BizTalk and system integration books. I'm a semi-frequent blogger. One of my blogging properties is middlwareinthecloud.com. I'm also a cloud editor for InfoQ, where I focus on cloud and integration related technologies. I do work in the energy industry in Canada, Calgary more specifically. If you're looking to follow me on Twitter, my handle's @Weirzy, and I've recently created a new Instagram account under the handle of Weirzy as well. So you may be asking yourself, why this vlog, this video blog? Why would you want to get involved in something like this? It's actually been something I've been thinking about for quite some time now. I've always been interested in doing some screencasts and recording and getting involved in the community. And it was at the recent MVP Summit where Jim Hare, the group PM for Pro Integration, challenged some of us MVPs to get more involved. And one of the topics that he was chatting about was getting involved in this video content. And I've always liked the idea of video content because I just find that you can do a lot more. It's easier to digest. It's easy to watch when you're on the train or when you're commuting, and figured this was a good opportunity. Afterwards, I was having some chats with Saravana Kumar of biztalk-360, and we came up with a plan where we felt that we could do something that was, beneficial for myself, beneficial for the community, and also biztalk-360 being a strong community advocate, we're happy to get involved and to help out. So that's really what this vlog is about. We're going to attempt to do this on a weekly basis. We're going to try to keep it relatively short, targeting around that 10 minute mark. And we'll do a variety of things, whether it's demonstrating some new capabilities of services that have come out. We'll introduce other guest speakers or vloggers. We'll also try to highlight other community content and just anything that I find particularly interesting. I will try to highlight that. Now, this isn't necessarily specific to Microsoft integration. Naturally, it'll be the primary, type of content that we're after. However, if there's some other platforms that are doing some interesting things, we certainly won't shy away from at least discussing them and making the Microsoft integration community aware of them if it is actually newsworthy. So let's get into it. Let's get into our feature content for the week. So today what we want to talk about is protecting Azure Logic Apps with Azure API Management. Now, a question you may be asking is, why should I use these two technologies together? Why would I want to do this? So number one, I'll set the context as, this is a scenario where you're going to have a Logic app where you've exposed it through an HTTP endpoint. So for example, you may be expecting a post, and naturally you could just leave it out there as is. You don't actually have to use API management, but I think you'd be missing out on some opportunities. And so here's some of the opportunities that I see when using Azure API management in front of Azure Logic Apps. One would be abstraction. So naturally, when you have an API, you've got some level of a consuming client. Now, you don't necessarily want to allow or show your consuming client all of your implementation details, right? They don't need to know where the service is running. Is it in the cloud? Is it on-prem? What is the kind of code or the stack that's running behind it? And API management gives us one way of doing that level of abstraction. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to change our backend without actually interrupting or disrupting our consuming client. So for example, perhaps you've got an API and you want to put that in front of Azure Logic Apps. You actually can do that without actually breaking the consuming client if you're using Azure API Management as an abstraction layer. Another opportunity is in the area of performance. Many API management platforms, including Azure API Management, provide the ability to cache a response for a common request. So for example, if you have an application that fetches common static data, like company master data, you don't necessarily want to fetch this same data set on every request. These redundant calls can become expensive, especially when you start to bridge a mobile application with an on-premise line of business system. So you can typically save a few hundred milliseconds to a few seconds by caching this type of information and increasing your end user satisfaction. Another area of performance improvements is just around the idea of rate limiting. So for example, if you've got a freemium service and you want to restrict how many times a consumer can call your service within a minute, that's something you can easily implement inside of Azure API management. And the idea is that you're protecting your back-end systems, from all of these freemium customers to ensure that your premium customers are actually having a good experience. Another opportunity is in the area of security. Certainly with Logic Apps, when you provide an endpoint, it is going to be an HTTPS endpoint, and you're going to have a SAS token, which is technically used as your credentials. For some organizations, this isn't enough. They're looking for some additional security solutions on top of it. So when using Azure API Management, there's some other technologies that we can layer on top, including OAuth 2.0, Azure Active Directory. We can connect to backend virtual networks. We can use mutual certificate authentication and also basic authentication if we really want. The next area of opportunity is in the agility layer. And with agility, we have the opportunity to use out-of-the-box policies provided by Azure API Management that are small but very powerful in the sense that we can change payload formats very simply, for example, from XML to JSON or vice versa. We can deal with some simple string manipulation. We can check or modify HTTP headers. We can set HTTP status codes, initiate retries, and even log to an event hub if we really want to. We also have the ability to use monitoring. And while the telemetry for Azure Logic Apps is quite good, there's some advantages when using Azure API Management's out-of-the-box telemetry. In many cases, it's related to region-specific information. So within Azure API Management, you've essentially heat maps where you can see where your clients are calling from, which part of the world. It's all visually mapped out. You also have more insight into the overall performance, including the time that's spent inside of the API Management proxy. You can actually see traffic or consumption data based upon client keys that are provided, and you can also check what requests are being blocked by the API proxy in order to prevent unauthorized access to your backend service. And lastly, the area I want to talk about is API orchestration. Certainly when you're dealing with an API ecosystem, especially API apps or connectors, they're technically, or for the most part, are all REST-based APIs that could be called directly from a consuming client or even could be put behind an API management instance. But I think there's some value in actually using Logic Apps for API orchestration where we can actually stitch some of these interdependent API calls together using Logic Apps and actually reduce some of the complexity on our consuming clients. So the example that I'm going to walk you through is a scenario where we're going to use ServiceNow, which is a popular IT service management SaaS application. I've built an API app, really a connector, that is going to wrap some of these RESTful APIs with Swagger so that we can easily plug it into Azure Logic Apps. Now what we're going to see is there's some very fine-grained API calls or API operations that exist here related to getting a user's details, getting an assignment group's details, and then creating an actual incident through a post. Now we could have these very discrete API operations exposed to our client, but if the client really just wants to log a ticket, why would they want to go through the process of calling each of these individual services, constructing their own message, this aggregate message in order to create an incident? We can do that really easily with Logic Apps without writing a whole lot of code and provide a really good experience for our client application. So let's now take a look at the actual Logic App implementation. So the first thing we have here is an inbound request trigger. And we have a JSON schema that represents the payload that we're expecting to receive inbound. Now this was something that was developed with JSON-schema.net, and I've been able to paste it into Logic Apps itself. Once I go ahead and actually save this particular card or this trigger, we'll see that I now have a URL which includes my SAS token for authentication. So if I go ahead and take this URL, put it into Postman, I'll actually be able to call this particular logic app, and I can copy this URL by clicking on the copy button. Next, what I need to do is I need to actually get the user details, and the user ID that is coming as part of the initial request will help me do that. And we'll find out why I need to go ahead and retrieve these user details when we get to the create ticket part of the logic app. I need to do something similar when it comes to the assignment group. Same thing, I need to get a particular reference ID called sysid for that particular group that I want to assign a ticket to, and I can then use these pieces of information when actually going ahead and creating my particular ticket. So here's the sysid that was returned from the get assignment group call, and then I now have a sysid attribute that was from the get user call. Now the rest of these attributes that I'm going to provide when creating this ticket are really coming from that inbound request message. Now we're going to look at the API management side of this solution. So I'm in the new portal, not the old portal where you typically find the Azure API management publisher portal, but in the new portal, we're going to look at a public preview version of the service. So on my blade here on the left-hand side, I've got API management service. I can go ahead and click on that. I've got 2 configured within my particular subscription. I'm going to choose Logic Apps API for this particular example. Next, I'm going to click on APIs preview. Now, this is probably the coolest part of the whole new experience, is that I have the ability to add a new API based upon existing services. So for example, open API specification, logic apps, Waddle, WSDL, function apps, and API apps coming soon. So for the purpose of this demo, we want to choose logic app. Now I have the ability to go ahead and do a search. And here's where my ServiceNow APIs are actually found. So I'm just going to, as an example, select this LA ServiceNow get user. I can go ahead and select that. I can change the description. I can provide an API URL suffix, and then I can actually go ahead and finish creating that particular API management experience. So I'm going to cancel out of this because I've already gone ahead and built an example. And using that same method, I went ahead and created a service management API. Now this will look very different than the previous version of API management, where we've got more of a visual canvas. Within this design surface, you can see we've got different stages of the API lifecycle. We've got front end, inbound processing, back end, and outbound processing. The other thing to note is you have the ability to set different policies at essentially a global level, so all operations, or we can click on and deal with policies at an operation level. So as we can see, when we went ahead and imported our Azure Logic app, a lot of data was preloaded for us, including, our post and basically the URI where we can expect to send that data. We can then take a look at the inbound processing, and we can do so by clicking on the form-based editor to see some of the characteristics that have been set. So for example, our backend URL rewrite includes all of the additional query parameters that Azure Logic Apps is expecting, in addition to the SAS key that would have been created inside of our actual Logic app. We can also go ahead and take a look at the code view, and we can see all of the settings that are loaded automatically. In addition, we can also add additional policies that are out of the box with Azure API Management and include them in our specific operation. Next, we can look at the backend, and to no surprise, we have an Azure resource that has been specified and the actual Logic app that we had created previously and imported. We can also take a look at outbound processing. Now, in my particular use case, I don't have any additional logic going on here, but if I needed to provide an outbound header or I wanted to override a body, I would have the ability to go ahead and do so. Another thing to note is on the front end, you may want to go ahead and change the display name and the description, just because of the defaults coming out of the Logic app may not be overly intuitive because it'll be called manual run But in addition, we also have the ability to define additional query parameters or headers. We can also define some request content types, examples, and schemas. We can do the same thing with responses as well. At this point, our entire solution has been configured and we're able to go ahead and test it. Now, historically, you've had to leave the authoring portal, the authoring API management portal, and head over to the developer portal in order to go ahead and test. Now, the developer portal still exists, but we also have this new test tab, and we can go ahead and click on test, and we can click on our specific operation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and provide a message body that we can actually go ahead and send to our API management instance, which in turn will call our logic app, go ahead and do that API orchestration, and then give us back the result of creating a ticket in ServiceNow. So I'm going to go ahead and click the send button, and we see that we do have an HTTP response created that includes our ticket number. So that concludes our demonstration of protecting Azure Logic Apps using Azure API Management. There's only one other concept that I do want to cover before we move on, and that's related to preventing unauthorized access to your Logic app. So we chatted before about a SAS key being embedded as part of the URL for the request trigger. Now, for a lot of organizations, that's not enough. They'd like a little bit more rigor around that. And in order to address those requirements, the Azure Logic Apps team provided an access control configuration. So when I select a particular Logic app, I can go ahead and click on this link. And then what we'll see is there's the ability to select inbound IPs or other Logic apps that are only allowed to call your specific Logic app. And then what you can do is actually put an IP range for your content. Now, if you're using Azure API Management in the standard or the premium tier, what you do get is a static IP for the life of the tenant. So there are a few caveats, and I'll refer you to the MSDN documentation. But for the most part, that will work for you. Well, you will have a static IP, and basically what you do is you enable trust between Logic Apps and your API Management tenant, and therefore only requests can come from that particular IP address in order to route to your Azure Logic app. I hope you found that demo of interest. It is some new content since the Azure API Management bits are in public preview, and also the Logic Apps functionality to restrict IP addresses is relatively new as well. I believe the Logic Apps team covered that in a Logic Apps Live webinar not too long ago. So moving on, I want to talk about some community content. First up, I wanted to chat about the MVP renewal cycle. So for those that may not be aware, the Microsoft MVP program issues, I guess, both new and renewals quarterly, starting January 1st. So January 1st was actually my renewal cycle, so I'm happy to be renewed as an MVP for another year. In addition, there's some of other colleagues and friends here that were also renewed, so I just wanted to call that out. If I happen to miss you, it's not on purpose. I just must have missed it inside of Twitter and other social media outlets. Next up, I wanted to call out some blog posts. These are the year in review type of posts that people tend to put out, every time there's the calendar rolls over. I'm no exception to this. I try to do this every year. I think it's a good opportunity to reflect on the work that you've done in the previous year, but also get some insight into where's your head is at going forward. I know for me, I spend a lot of time on blockchain and Bitcoin and digital currencies, and that was something I didn't expect coming into 2016. It just happened midway through, and it's something that I do find a lot of interest in, something I'll continue to look at going forward into 2017. But I will link these other posts up. I won't go through each one because we don't have a lot of time. We're way over my planned quota for this particular instance, but I did find these particular posts of interest, so they're worth checking out. So feedback. I'm interested in feedback, good or bad. What did you like about the show? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of? Are there any particular topics or people that you would like to have a guest appearance on the particular segment? So I've got a Twitter handle here, Middleware Fry. There was a character restriction if you're wondering why it's that. Also, there's an email address. Feel free to send feedback via that channel. And thanks a lot for tuning in. Want to just also give a few credits. The music was something I picked up off of SoundCloud. It was freely distributable, so feel free to check that out if you enjoyed the music clip. Also want to thank biztalk-360 for their support in the show. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon on Middleware Friday.
Yeah.